I'm here with David Paul Kuhn and Marc Levin, director and the author and producers of Hard Hat Riot. I guess this documentary is dense. This has a bunch in it. What was it like kind of cutting through footage and figuring out what to put in and what to leave or what to leave out?
That was I would say the big filmmaking challenge is we wanted to create the sense of you living through this historic week. David, what's the quote about the week?
So I mean, I'm going to paraphrase the New Yorker, but basically, certainly the most tumultuous periods in more than a century. So to give perspective to that, this is 2 years after 1968. This is after RFK was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. This is after Chicago happened. So for the New Yorker to feel that way at that time, it captures why this week becomes a microcosm for our story. It was so important and telling.
And my point was that we wanted you to feel immersed in that week, what it was like to live through that week, from Nixon's escalation of the war into Cambodia to the colleges around the country going on strike, to the tragedy of 4 students being shot at Kent State, to finally this confrontation on the streets of downtown Manhattan. Yet, as David just mentioned, what happened in 68, help inform everything that was to happen this week. What was happening in Vietnam, what was happening in the lives and the neighborhoods of the characters, especially the hard hat characters in our film. So that was the challenge, how to weave all that in, but not lose that momentum. David just mentioned Chicago 68. You asked, what's left out? Well, there's one thing right there. It's in David's book and it's important, but we just couldn't fit it in. So there are a number of things, but I think that was the real challenge of the film, was to get as much context. Who was John Lindsay? What was happening in New York City? How its economy was changing? How crime was impacting things? How the lives in the neighborhoods that so many of the Italian and Irish immigrants moved into, how all that was happening, but weave it into this week and not lose that thread.
I think that's important too, because like a lot of documentaries, they leave out certain context because they're trying to do one agenda or another. And like you say, when you put in the content, like obviously every cut's a lie, and but when you're trying to do a documentary, you want to try to be as honest to the whole truth as possible. So like how do you guys, I don't know, what would be the mission statement when doing stuff like this?
That is a good question. I think it's years of experience. I mean, obviously, David spent years researching, so we had a tremendous help in somebody who was steeped in this, who knew the history, had examined the primary sources. But in the end, yeah, you got to rely on your own sensibility of what's balanced, what's fair. I mean, we did have a minor conflict that, now is out in the public that, we could talk about, the final shot of the film. We thought was important. It's in David's book. In the afterword, Ronald Reagan's campaign stop in New York, September 1980, where he ended his speech saying, "Make America Great Again." I had never seen that clip, and I read about it in David's book, found the clip. It's not in the version you saw. It's in the festival version, and that was an issue with American Experience, which is a great, group of people, and it's an incredible history, 40-year history, but they felt that was not necessarily appropriate to put at the end of the film. We felt it was a way to close the loop and the echoes to, that reverberate right to today. So it's a constant dialogue back and forth between us as the filmmakers, the executives of American Experience. And we do show rough cuts sometimes to small groups of people to get to see how is it playing, how are they reacting. I mean, one reaction, and David, I don't know if you were there, but, there was some pushback we got at one point midway where they felt we were too unfair to the anti-war movement, to the student movement, to the protest movement, which I found interesting because obviously that was the world I was from and part of back in the 60s and early 70s.
And I think, there's going to be that reaction because the story of the 60s and 70s has been told almost entirely from the student counterculture perspective. They're the heroes, they're the protagonists. And one of the many missions of my book was to show that, while along the way of all these righteous struggles to better America, mistakes happened. Some of those mistakes are being relived to this day. And if we don't also learn from the hard lessons of history, along the way to perhaps the victories, unfortunately, history does repeat. And, to paraphrase Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And the mission of the book and eventually this film is to return to a very troubled time, a more troubled time than our own. And with the distance that history allows, perhaps strike the beginning of empathy that can, perhaps help us cross certain divides today.
Yeah, watching that riot towards the end, or like just everything just went chaos. It was like you said, we're not there yet, but you can kind of see us kind of heading down that path, and it's kind of scary. And yeah, history shouldn't repeat itself, but we're humans. We're stupid. That's what we do. But
try to be better versions of that. That's all we can do.
Yeah, but you said you got some pushback. I think that it's weird to say, but that's almost a compliment for something like this, because if you're trying to present all sides fairly, that's got to be, and then to get pushback on something that you agree with, that's got to be kind of a thing to say that, hey, I must be on the right path here.
Well,
sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I think that, as David's made the point, the story of the counterculture and that era had ignored this side of the story. And to David's credit, he dug deep. Certainly, I knew about the event, but until I read his book, I didn't realize the significance of the event. Again, I was a 19-year-old kid who was obsessed with, the Knicks winning the NBA championship and working on a film about the Rolling Stones in the end of the 60s. So I was lost in my own bubble. But the significance is just so relevant to today's discussions. And I think part of the myopia is not just listening to the stories of others who you don't agree with, but also we focus on the economic issues, which are absolutely fundamental. And David makes the point in the film that 1973 really was the peak earnings relative to the increased wealth in the United States of the construction workers. They haven't made progress since then like they had up to that point. But it's the cultural side of the equation that Nixon and then Reagan were able to realize, to speak to connect with in a real, just human way that is very powerful and can't be ignored. And so I think that is especially important as we face the ongoing partisan crises that we're living with today. Even you mentioned, look, when we saw the film 2 nights ago at the premiere, I hadn't even thought about the Charlie Kirk tragedy and all the arguments going on about whether the flag should be at half-mast or at full-mast. And then watching the film again, there was the same argument going on at City Hall over whether the flag should be at half-mast or full-mast for the 4 students that were killed by the National Guard at Kent State, except the roles were reversed.
Yeah, I mean, and that speaks to one of the challenges of filmmaking, and certainly the book. This is something that can be much more easily done in a book. But for making the film, we had to somehow get across very briefly that the flag burning then was much more shocking than it is now. We kind of grew up in an era where we've had these debates for a half century, but at that time, it had only just begun. And for World War II veterans, for Korean veterans, for Vietnam veterans, it was shocking. And to quickly translate that and why it felt personal to them and why they had their own sense of standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Because when that flag's burned, to them, they're seeing their dead comrades from war. So to convey, this other side also had their sense of righteous cause. And to try to translate that very quickly in film, that's one of the challenges, and we hope it succeeds.
Yeah. Well, this was a really great documentary. Hard Hat Riot will, I believe, premiere Tuesday, September 30th at 9:00 on PBS. And it's on the American Experience. What's that? I'm sorry. What's the American Experience? Is that the umbrella?
The Institution of America. They've been around for roughly 4 decades out of Boston, and it's pretty much the gold standard in historical documentaries. They're having funding issues, and it may be canceled. It is as of now. And so it's a part of American Experience, aired nationally on PBS on September 30th.
Okay. Well, Mark, David, thanks for joining me, and congratulations on the documentary.
Thank you.